Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We are continuing our discussion today on the topic of women in waterfowl. We had out on a previous episode a focus mostly on women in the profession of waterfowl, wetland conservation. We have three outstanding guests joining us on that episode, and they're joining us again, and they each shared their experiences, each coming from sort of different stages in their career and sharing their perspectives and how they may have varied in response to that. We're going to continue that discussion today. We're going to touch on a few additional topics beyond just the professional aspect of being a woman in this field. And notably, we're going to start out with a discussion related to women in waterfowl hunting and what that's like. But then later on, we're going to transition to a discussion about some of the other initiatives that are actually underway to promote gender diversity within the natural resources field, within the waterfowl field. So we're going to be happy to bring those to you. And then we'll conclude, of course, with some additional advice from these three amazing guests on all aspects of this topic. So with that, I'm happy to welcome back in our guest on this show, Dr. Susan Ellis-Felici from University of North Dakota. Susan, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And Dr. Carla Gwynn, the Chief Executive Officer for Ducks Unlimited Canada. Carla, welcome back.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
And Casey Seatash, a PhD student at Colorado State University. Casey, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
We have a lot to get to, so we're going to jump right into it. The first thing I will say, though, is to remind people that may have missed the previous episode. Number one, I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. Lots of great information there. But the other is that we are well aware that this conversation we're having now about gender diversity in this profession, in society, in any aspect of what we do, is not independent of a larger discussion of diversity and inclusion among broader societal components and groups that make up our society. So we clearly recognize that. We're having a discussion here focused on gender diversity in waterfowl and waterfowling because it's something that has been on our mind for a number of years, a number of months here with respect to the podcast. We're seeing some good progress within this field in respect to gender diversity. And so we wanted to share some of those specific stories with you. We will have an opportunity in the future to expand this discussion related to diversity and inclusion. So just wanted people to have that information up front and know that we are certainly well aware of the relatedness of this conversation to those. So with that, we're going to get into a discussion of waterfowl hunting and women in waterfowl hunting. And Casey, I'm going to go to you first because unlike Susan and Carla, you didn't grow up hunting. You were, of the three we have, you came into waterfowl hunting just recently. And we had, I think I mentioned this on the previous episode, we had Dr. Kevin Ringelman, Dr. John Eady, and two of Kevin's former students that had participated in something they called a university hunt program designed to introduce students to hunting, waterfowl hunting specifically. And so they shared with us their stories of how Maddie and Julie, the two students that participated on that episode, shared with us their stories of how they came into waterfowl hunting through that program, why they came into waterfowl hunting, and what it was like for them. So Casey, this is your opportunity to kind of share some of that same thought process and those same experiences. And so I guess the first question is, did you have an opportunity to be introduced to waterfowl hunting through any of those organized university hunt programs? I'm not sure if there's one currently active at Colorado State, but so as part of your response, just share some of that with us.
Yeah, so there is a brand new hunt program at Colorado State that Dave Coons has set up. And so I did actually get to go on the inaugural hunt for that. I was planning on just kind of being there as a helper because I had actually hunted a few times before that. But it turned out it was my first goose hunt, and it was one of the better hunts that I think anyone would have ever experienced. It was like a nice foggy day, and just hundreds and hundreds of geese came into our decoys. And we got a limit of I think 6 or 7 people within an hour and a half. It was amazing. So I did get to participate in that. And there were so many birds that they said, even though this isn't your first hunt, go ahead and shoot if you want to. But I actually did start hunting about a year or two before that. When I started my master's, I guess, yeah, it would have been 2 or 3 years before that. I was, getting into the waterfowl field and realizing that as I went to conferences and as I met people in the field, one of their first questions out of their mouth was almost always, do you hunt? And I kind of felt a little bit left out saying no. And I wanted to have something to be able to talk to people about. And also I was just getting more interested in, where my food comes from, harvesting things sustainably and locally, et cetera. And I decided to, get my hunter safety. And it also happened to be right around the same time I started dating my now fiance, who was instrumental in this whole process. He did grow up hunting and was really into waterfowl hunting when he did his master's in Texas. So as soon as I got that hunter safety, we went on our first couple hunts. And, a year later, we got a black lab. And the rest is kind of history. It's been a really interesting kind of evolution of just learning the processes. And I actually I started deer hunting as well throughout in the last couple of years, and I've really enjoyed that here in Colorado. Just kind of scampering through the mountains. Sometimes I do enjoy it a little bit more than duck hunting, I have to say, just because we get some cold mornings out here. Last year, opening day was 18 degrees in October. So it was a little rough. But yeah, I don't think I could have done it without a mentor, especially as an adult coming into it. There were so many obstacles just learning about guns and what kind of gun would be best for me and shooting. And, especially getting a dog has made a huge difference.
Susan, a question for you now. Casey referenced on the previous episode her experiences and how it's difficult to break into waterfowling. As a waterfowler myself, I can certainly appreciate that. But the question here is, do you think the difficulty of getting into waterfowling is a bit greater for women? And if so, what are some of the most important steps that can be taken to overcome those challenges and difficulties as you've kind of experienced them and as you might see them?
Yeah, I do think there's some challenges there. I mean, there is some stigma that a lot of times, hunting, particularly in these groups, there's a little bit of a paradigm shift of what that looks like in the hunting arena. But I think that's happening as we see, one of the fastest growing groups of hunters is women. And as more families are approaching it, I think that's an important thing as well. But when you're already an adult, it is challenging. So we also have our own sort of version of a university hunt program. And most of the time it's females. And when you talk to the young women in that, it's guys sometimes don't get, or they get more often just the invites, where women sometimes don't get those invites. And then there's levels of even that confidence thing that we talked about, going out there and doing something really different, especially if that ends up being where you're working with the people who maybe you're, in your career path. Sometimes that's a little awkward while you're trying to learn that could be intimidating. And so I think these hunt programs at the university level are tremendous places for women to get that experience. The challenge with that, though, is the persistence of it. Bringing women in, one experience is great, but that's not enough to make a hunter. Now, especially for waterfowl, because it's very gear intensive. By the time it can be very gear intensive, at least the way a lot of times we see it portrayed. There's all these decoys, there could be boats, there's these layout blinds, there's, all these different things. And those could be obstacles that people see in terms of entering that world. So I do think for women, it can be more challenging. But there is also now, I think, a lot more programs designed for women, which I think there's a lot of potential there for that to be a barrier we're breaking down.
Susan, I want to follow up with you on a couple of things there. The first one being, as a guy, I waterfowl hunt. I have waterfowl hunted for 20 plus years. I enjoy hunting by myself as much as I do hunting with a group of people. Do you think that differs between men and women? Do you think? Do you know of other women that enjoy hunting by themselves as much as they do with groups? Is there some social difference there between men and women with respect to how they like to hunt?
I think that could be the case. I think it depends on what you're hunting. And because I grew up doing it with my dad and his cohort of friends, and I saw that it was a real opportunity, to spend time together enjoying the outdoors. The jokes that were made, a lot of times I don't remember what we got on any given day, but I remember some of the jokes about the dogs or the goofy things we did, when it was early morning, as Casey says, it's really cold some of these mornings, the things you do to stay warm, those type things stand out a lot. That being said, when I deer hunt, I do a lot of deer hunting, at least historically, very much individually, where you might sit in a tree stand, and that's maybe more of a lone sport, if you would. Though some of the other things that I've done with mule deer and spot and stalk type things, that's sometimes nice to have a team in that way. But yes, I think that the camaraderie is probably a big piece that helps women to enjoy it, because they see it as that opportunity to share the outdoors together.
What about women hunting with men or women hunting with women? Is that going to be just sort of an individual preference type thing?
Yeah, I think that probably is an individual preference. I don't know. Maybe others can speak to that. I've hunted with men and women, though admittedly most of my life has been predominantly with men, because I grew up kind of that way. And, my husband and I do a lot together hunting. And so I've hunted less with women. There were also less women to hunt with as I've progressed through my hunting phase until now, where my little girl comes along and hunts. The only other person in terms of women that sort of hunted with me was my sister. So that was kind of my exposure to, women hunting with me was just my sister, just very family oriented.
Casey, I want you to answer that question. Then I've got something for Carla.
I do think it's pretty individual based, but I will say I've gone on a couple all women hunts at this point, and they've been some of the more memorable ones, just because it's with my own friends rather than with people I'm trying to learn from and have as a mentor kind of. And I feel like that's kind of a rare event among female waterfowlers. And I also felt like, when we're all going after a same group of birds, there's a little bit better communication among all the women that are out there. That might just be those individuals, but I won't make any generalizations.
Carla, my question for you is, who's the better shot, you or Jim?
Oh, Jim is for sure. There's no question there.
But that does lead me to a serious question. I want to hear a story about from one of you about how when you were the better shot than one of the men that you were hunting with, and how they may have reacted. Or maybe I could say this another way: how important is it to your confidence to be able to be a decent shot when hunting with men?
I can start for sure, because I'm not a great shot, and I am the first to admit it. And usually, as soon as I get into the blinds, I tell the people I'm with, I'm a lousy shot, so please back me up, and do not be afraid to back me up. It's the first thing I say. So yeah, I think because I know I'm not great, but then I admit it up front, and I'm not trying to be something I'm not. But I have on occasion had some pretty amazing shots, and the guys I'm with are super encouraging, and they'll bring it up, years later. So they've always been really encouraging.
I might be able to follow that up with my sister. So I'm a perfectly average shot. Some days I'm terrible. Some days I surprise myself. But I'm probably a pretty average in terms of abilities of my shooting. But my sister is amazing and has been from when she was young. And so when she started hunting, and when she was 12 in Pennsylvania is when you can hunt, she had a chance to go out on a really good dove field. And one of my dad's buddies had been out there for probably 4 hours already and was struggling. I don't know how many boxes of shells he went through. My sister shows up, and an hour and a half later has her 12 doves. And he was still struggling. And so he came over, and he ended up making her an award out of it all. And it was really great. He gave her a hand-carved dove that he had made for her, and saying, wow, this is amazing. I'm mildly embarrassed by it, but this is amazing. And so she got quite the recognition out of the group as being Deadeye, you know. And so it was as Carla indicated, very encouraging.
That's an awesome story. Carla, I will say that the way you proclaim your lack of shooting skill upon entering the blind is usually either the way I do it for myself or the way one of my shooting partners will do it on behalf of me. So I'm with you on that. Carla, I want to stay with you for this question. You are obviously in Canada, and we have some differences in society between Canada and the U.S. and there are actually even some of those trends, some of those differences are reflected in the trends we see in the number of hunters, number of waterfowl hunters in Canada versus the States. They're actually declining in both the U.S. and in Canada, but the decline has been a bit more long-term and a bit more steep in Canada. So this question of hunting and conservation, do you have to be a hunter to be a conservationist? I certainly don't think that's the case. I want to get your thought on that. But then also the idea of being able to relate to our hunter constituency as a wetland and waterfowl conservation organization, and the importance for all of us, not just women, but men and women, to be able to relate to this important hunter constituency. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. And you're right, Mike. There is quite a difference between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to waterfowling. As you pointed out, the number of waterfowl hunters is substantially less in Canada, and it has been undergoing a steep decline for a number of decades, actually. When I try to think about why, there really is, it's a different culture. At least, my experience is that, waterfowl hunting, particularly in the southern U.S., it's almost a lifestyle. Like, people are living it almost 12 months of the year. If you aren't duck hunting, you're getting ready to go duck hunting. And in Canada, it's just not like that. It's just not like that. Particularly people that live on the prairies, it often is, they might go out a couple of weekends, a few weekends during the season, but it's not something that they focus the entire year on. And, why? Well, when we have great access, the number of hunt clubs in Canada is tiny, right? There's hardly any. There's a few in Manitoba. There's a few in Southern Ontario, a few in Quebec, but it's nothing like it is in the U.S. And I don't know if that has part of the reason why, but it's just approached very differently in Canada than the U.S. Your second question about, do you need to be a hunter to be a conservationist? Well, I don't believe so. But what I do think is important is it's really important that people who are interested in conservation understand how much hunters have helped support the conservation effort, whether through their direct purchase of, hunting licenses and stamps, or their personal donations and commitment to the cause. And that's something I always like to talk about. And a lot of people who are non-hunters don't understand that. They don't understand, and they find it odd that somebody can be a hunter and still want to contribute to conservation. And it takes them a while to sort of figure that out. What's interesting is that, over the last 5-6 years, we've hired a number of younger women biologists, and many of them had never hunted. And a few of them last fall, they recognized, just like you were talking about, Mike, they recognized that they wanted to understand that connection between hunting and conservation. And so a number of them went out on their first hunt last fall, and really to try to understand that psyche and to try to have that experience so that they could relate to our supporters.
Casey, as the one of the three women on this call that did not grow up hunting, kind of came into this late in your early in your adulthood, let's say. What advice would you give to other women that are in your position, and that would be in the position that Carla just described, young biologists, women biologists that had never hunted, but they were wanting to understand that connection between hunting and what motivates those hunters to be such active participants in conservation, or that women that just want to try out hunting for any other reason. You talked about wanting to understand and know where your food is coming from, the locavore movement, as we've heard talked about over the past few years. What advice would you give women that are interested in trying their hand at hunting, whether it be waterfowl hunting or any other type of hunting?
I think nowadays there are so many programs in place just for that purpose. There's Becoming an Outdoor Woman. There's Field to Fork, which, these aren't all waterfowl focused. But there are even specific mentoring programs within duck hunting, clubs or organizations. And I really do think finding a mentor, trying it out with somebody who already has all the gear that we talked about, can be invaluable because you get the full experience without having to kind of struggle your way through it on your own at first. And if you have that one amazing experience, that might be enough to kind of keep you in there, retain you as a hunter into the future. So really trying to seek out those programs or those people who can be that mentor for you is the most valuable thing you can do if you want to get into it, I think.
What about, I might say psychologically? I know the idea of killing an animal is something that's very difficult for non-hunters, especially. I would imagine it's something that's more difficult to overcome when you first start entertaining that idea as an adult, as opposed to maybe when you are younger and you're following the direction of your sibling or your father or mother in the blind or in the field. But when you are a young adult and you're able to process information in a more cerebral manner than, let's say, you are younger, is there some other psychological aspect of this that you kind of have to overcome, the idea of killing an animal at that stage of your life? And how would you kind of advise thinking about that? Is there anything that comes to mind in that regard?
I actually had a really hard time with that when I first started. I definitely was not as good a shot as I should have been. And I crippled a bunch of birds when I first started out. And we didn't have a dog. We were in really thick vegetation, and they just got away immediately. And it was almost enough to completely discourage me. It was like 4 or 5 birds in a row, and I was just done. And, it only then took 1 or 2 good successes to go back and say, oh, I can do this. It's again, kind of that confidence thing. You making sure that you are prepared enough and can actually be a good enough shot to find the mark, I think is especially important when you're first starting out, just so that you don't have those bad experiences that can then discourage you. And I think, again, that is where a good mentor kind of comes in, who will keep encouraging you and, maybe take the bird to finish it off if you do cripple it, or kind of ease you into that. I think that's kind of where the food aspect came in for me. I'm really, really into cooking and food in general, and kind of being able to, give thanks to the animal that you've harvested by preparing it in an incredible way was really helpful for me to seeing, the whole process and being okay with the fact that I took this animal's life because I'm doing the best that I can with it.
That message there resonates immensely with me. We live here in West Tennessee, and we have a small piece of property here. But the other night, my wife and I had a meal that included venison, which the deer was actually taken from the back part of our property. I processed the deer on our property. I processed the meat here in the kitchen, and then the vegetables that we had were grown in our garden. So every aspect, with exception of a few spices and maybe some fat that I added to the venison when it was being processed, every aspect of that meal was derived, not just by our own hands, but by the very piece of property that we are on right now. And so we actually take a great deal of pride in every aspect of that, but also in a little bit of the habitat management that we do on our land here. So that to me the other night kind of really emphasized exactly what you were saying, Casey, the idea of really being able to appreciate where the food came from and recognizing what it took to make that happen. And Casey, you also mentioned in your response the important, and we've done it several times, the importance of a mentor. And because of the demographics of the waterfowling field right now, mostly men, predominantly men, most of the mentors that you're going to have access to are going to be men. So Casey, I asked you about advice for women wanting to get into waterfowling or any other kind of hunting. I think it's equally important to talk about advice for men in serving a role in helping make this more possible and more welcoming for women that are interested in participating in hunting as equal participants in this conservation, in that aspect of conservation. So Susan, what would you say? What advice would you give to men in terms of mentorship or in terms of creating welcoming environments for women to participate in hunting?
I think some of that roots back to even my childhood, where my dad had 2 daughters, and his hunting buddies welcomed us right into the group. You see that commonly done with sons, and even if mom doesn't hunt, that shouldn't be a barrier for a young, a little girl to break in and go out there. And so I encourage hunters to welcome, the children, both the boys and the girls, into their hunts. I think that's an important first step. And as we talked about, it's been a gateway not only in my hunting, but also a gateway in my professional approaches, is to see that that's a welcoming environment, and it's not something that's gender specific. In addition to that, if you're going to reach out as a hunter and be a mentor, don't just ask the neighbor, father and son, ask the family. We're seeing, as has already been addressed, a lot more women are interested in the food aspects, and something more to that hunting than, and in many cases, women just need that invitation. And so invite the family. Don't make it something that is just limited to the fathers and sons. I think that's a really important step that's going to help, break down some barriers for the next generation of hunters.
Susan was just talking about the inviting the entire family hunting, and I want to dial into that a bit. Let's suppose there are some women listening to this episode, and they get the idea that they want to go hunting, and their husband hunts, and then they ask their husband, or express an interest to their husband in going hunting. What advice do you give to the husband in regard to that? In terms of making that environment more welcoming for the wife? This might be a tricky question, but what advice do you give to the men when their wives ask about going hunting? Because I think it's really important, as Susan was talking about, invite the entire family. I don't know if there's any research out there that has looked at the retention rate of young hunters in families where both the husband and wife hunted versus just the husband. But it seems to me that if the entire family hunts, then there's a stronger chance that the kids are going to actually grow up and be hunters when they become adults. So from that perspective, if the wife indicates an interest in hunting to the husband, what should the husband say?
Well, I hope that would be encouraging, number one. But circling back to Susan's point, I think the first thing is just, extending that invitation. Don't always assume that the woman doesn't want to go hunting. That often is the case, is that the wife or woman or girl doesn't get invited, and because they just assume that they don't want to go. Well, don't make that assumption, because they might want to go. And if they do want to go, really encourage them, be supportive while they're out there. And maybe the first time they go, maybe they don't want to shoot. That's okay. Just let them come out and experience it and see it and feel it, so that they become more comfortable with it. And then they most likely are going to want to shoot. So, just make it a welcoming and supportive experience for them.
I think that's a really important point, Carla, about not putting pressure on women when they're in the blind, or even young people when they're in the blind, when we're trying to recruit new hunters. Just let them enjoy the experience first off, and not put that pressure on them, because then it becomes an experience that they don't remember terribly fondly, and that's not what we want. So, Susan, anything to add to that?
I think that point is incredibly critical about just going along. So much of the hunt is emphasized a lot of times in how it's portrayed to everyone, the public, about the harvest, the kill, if you would. And it's not that. It's being there. There was a tremendous article when I was a child. I think the author was Mary Lovelace in a Ducks Unlimited magazine that was about being there. It's the preparation of it. It's the whole process of it. And I started hunting. I was 10 years old when I started going along with my dad. And in Pennsylvania, you can't hunt. You can't pull the trigger until you're 12. So I spent 2 years just tagging along. 2 years never pulling the trigger. And as a result, in fact, my sister started hunting when she could pull the trigger, basically. And we have gone a little bit different paths in our growth as hunters because of that. I am much more comfortable going out and just sitting there, and I might carry a gun, but most of the time it's the being there, because that's what hunting was for me from the very first time I did it. And I think that's something that a lot of times women want to come along. They may not want to pull that trigger. And I know a few people who would go along with their husbands. They don't actually carry a gun, but they want to be out there. They want to be along on that. And that's an important part of this, bringing women into hunting.
I have an interesting story in that regard. My wife does not hunt. She has gone hunting with me before, as you described there, Susan. And one of the times that she went hunting was the day that I killed 2 banded Drake mallards. So she's a good luck charm. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to convince her to go back, and I haven't killed a banded duck since. So there's probably some connection there, and I need to take care of that issue. The other thing that I will say is I have to acknowledge that this is not just about wives in wanting to go hunting with their husbands. It's also about girlfriends wanting to go hunting with their boyfriends. So I want to make sure we point that out. Or fiancés, as in the case with Casey. And there may be others out there. So thank you for that discussion about about women in waterfowl hunting. We could talk about that subject a great deal more if we wanted to, but we have a few other questions that we need to get to. And we're going to transition back to sort of a work environment discussion. And the previous episode touched on a lot of your experiences being a woman in the waterfowl profession, some of the successes that have been achieved by each of you individually, as well as within our field more generally. But I do know there are some ongoing initiatives within the natural resources community to promote gender diversity within our field. I've actually seen an article here recently that talks about how the natural resources field, the outdoor industry more broadly, really does lag behind other aspects of society in our gender diversity and other aspects of diversity and inclusion as well. So within the waterfowl profession, we can start here, and we can branch out as we want to. And I guess, Susan, I'll start with you. What are some of the ongoing initiatives within the waterfowl community to promote gender diversity? Can we identify some of those?
Probably the one that particularly Casey and I and Carla can all discuss is most recently as part of the North American Duck Symposium. Women in the waterfowl have started to join together and actually had a special session on women in waterfowl and addressing some issues about things like implicit bias, where we might not recognize some of the biases we have that's gender or any kind of diversity sort of things there. Talking about some of these topics of mentoring and helping to promote sort of these next steps of where are we at even with gender diversity within the profession. And that group has really launched off with, that was what, at least from my perspective, the most well-attended session at that symposium. It was sit on the floor only kind of space. But it's opening up doors of everyone having this discussion about what can we do to promote women not just getting into the field, but I think one of the biggest topics is, and Casey addressed this a little bit in our previous episode, is keeping them there, keeping them among the ranks, helping them to be successful, feel like they belong, and even promote into fantastic leaderships like we have with Carla, where we have women being leaders in this profession. And, we don't see a lot of that right now, but I think that there's momentum from a group like that that's, trying to address those issues. And there were a lot of men in the room who said, what can we do? How can we help? And that's what we need. Other organizations and societies like the Wildlife Society has had, Women in Wildlife Group, and there's a variety of different organizations that have those type entities. But specifically, I think that this group through the Duck Symposium is going to be an instrumental group. We are continuing to meet regularly, working on some papers on, the history of women in waterfowl, trying to get a survey of, maybe what are reasons why women, we see a lot in the college level in terms of women, but we don't necessarily see them joining the ranks or staying in the ranks. And so trying to address those issues and finding solutions to help them be successful is sort of some of the next things we're tackling.
Carla, you're in a great position to add to this very question here and where Susan left off there about how do we keep women. We see a lot of women in undergraduate and graduate programs, an increasing percentage, but we don't necessarily see that translate into a growing percentage of women in the professional workplace, or they may enter the professional workplace, but we lack the ability, or for some reason we're not able to retain them in this profession throughout their career at a rate similar to the way we're seeing them come into the graduate and undergraduate levels. For a person in your position, CEO of the wetland conservation organization nationwide in Canada, and someone that I know is a strong proponent of gender diversity in this profession, what types of things are you thinking about? Is your organization thinking about, and do you think could be applied more broadly to help ensure we're able to retain women in our profession?
Well, I think besides the obvious one of mentorship and certainly helping employees develop within their careers, one of the other ones is just flexibility in thinking. So childcare is a big one when you're thinking about particularly young female employees. So in Canada, paternity leave is for a full year. So when someone goes on paternity leave, you're losing them for a year. And some people might see that as a drawback, but I think you can see it as an opportunity, because having that space vacant for a year gives you an opportunity for another staff person to take on some additional duties and for professional development for them. And, I have to say that, I'm thinking of 4 professional women in our organization right now that have juggled having kids during their career. And, one of the things that we often hear people say is, if you want something done, find a busy person. Now, I don't have kids, so I don't know how they do it, but they are some of the most productive people we have on staff, because they know how to juggle many things. They just know how to do it all and do an amazing job. So, it's just making the workplace welcoming to women.
Carla, one of the most memorable comments that you made, it might not have been, I guess it probably was at that session at the Duck Symposium where we discussed women in this profession. Someone asked about how we can do better minimizing the occurrence of instances of overt or sort of subliminal sexual harassment, because that, we have to be honest, that still exists. And your response to that was, and I think you were just speaking within your organization, is that there will be zero tolerance. There has to be a zero tolerance policy. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So over the last couple of years, we have instituted a respectful workplace training within Ducks Unlimited Canada, both for our staff and our board. And we have, for a number of years, even before that, really had a zero tolerance of any kind of harassment, sexual or otherwise. And, we've let people go because of it. And, it's been, I guess, pretty rewarding in some ways, in that the decisions to exit these people was done by other male employees. They were the ones that stepped up and said, I'm not tolerating this. There was no excuses. There was no defending it. They were like, this has got to stop. And they were the ones that stepped in and took the actions that needed to be done.
Casey, you are the youngest on this episode. You're the earliest in your career. You have the longest runway ahead of you with respect to working in this field. And you just heard two of the women that are leaders in this field talk about, give their thoughts on how we can improve the environment for women and make it more welcoming. How does that give you confidence? Does that give you hope? How does that make you feel to hear these two powerful women in positions of such strong leadership make those statements?
It gives me a lot of hope, and I am confident that a lot of the women that are at the stage of their career, the same career stage as me, have role models to look up to now in some of these positions of leadership. And the more we talk about this, the more there are both informal and formal structures in place to support diverse people in general and to retain them in the field. I mean, a lot of these programs that are being put into place benefit everybody, not just those minority groups. And I think there's, especially skills programs, things we don't really necessarily think about all that often, like negotiation skills or making salaries transparent at higher levels. Those can really have an impact on how far women especially are able to get in a particular agency. And, with childcare, I'm 28, I'm, starting to think about that. And it's definitely not something I've decided. But if I do go the academic route, there are huge things that I worry about. I mean, just, your success is measured by your publication record in academia. And there's some pretty strong research that there's huge discrepancies in those measures of productivity. There's an H index and measures, different paper metrics and publication metrics. And oftentimes parental leave or gaps in productivity are not taken into account in those. And so there's lots of different structural things that can be, we can focus on to kind of narrow that gap. And I think those conversations are starting to happen for sure.
Susan, you're a person that has actually faced the very challenges that Casey just described. And in fact, I'll let our listeners in on a little secret here. Susan is joining us from her home today. In the previous episode, she joined us from her office, but she's joining us from home today. And in the background, occasionally we will see her 2-year-old daughter kind of go bounding by. So this is another example where she's having to juggle those responsibilities of being a mother, as well as her professional responsibilities. So given what Casey just described, some of her concerns, have you had to deal with those? And how have you kind of processed that and dealt with it?
There's a lot we could unpack about this. It's a journey, and it's some days you feel like you're really on top of the world, and other days you're just happy you got yourself dressed. It can be a struggle. This COVID situation has had it where it's a real juggling. We haven't had real consistent childcare since March, and so that's been unique. But I think Carla hit something on the head that's very true about, busy people and whatnot. I was very good before I had my daughter at juggling a lot of things. I operated at very high efficiencies. In some ways, I have actually increased that efficiency. In other ways, it's not been pretty. But I think you have to be gentle on yourself and on each other in this process. There's a transition when you start going into parenthood and juggling that. And it happens for men and women. It's just very different depending on things. I went into motherhood thinking I could maybe beat some of the biology of it, and turns out even as a biologist, I had that naive thought. But mothers play a very important role in their children's lives. And as a result, as I mentioned earlier, I couldn't do a lot of things without my husband. My little girl goes with me everywhere. And some of you that were at the Duck Conference, if anyone was at that, my parents actually traveled so my little girl could be there, because I can't leave for a week when she was, young. I couldn't leave for a week without her being there. So we need each other, and that's an important part of it. When I go to the field, my whole family goes to the field. And I'm fortunate I have a husband whose job has that flexibility. I'm fortunate I have supportive parents who will come from Pennsylvania to North Dakota and then to Winnipeg or wherever to help facilitate that. I've been fortunate to have colleagues who have allowed me to take my little girl to a remote field camp. She went to the Hudson Bay, flew in a helicopter, saw polar bears, got to hold snow geese while we were banding them. It takes everyone stepping back and realizing we are juggling a lot, but we still can contribute through that. I actually had my most productive year, Casey. I was a co-author on 9 publications the year my little girl was born. Which was a big year for me. I've yet to have that again, but that was really important. My publication rate's been actually higher in general, but a lot of it's surrounding myself with good people, preparing and recognizing, a lot of publications happen well before the actual time that happens. You have to queue things up. And it's about, like I said, having an open mind about how things will come together and realistic. And I've been really fortunate to have a lot of support. Technically I was supposed to have 6 weeks of maternity leave. I ended up having to go back at 5 to help teach some stuff because no one could teach for me where I'm at. But I had been so productive. I had a very flexible chair who said, hey, you're doing your thing. As long as your teaching is covered, keep up the good work. And I managed to do things sometimes at odd hours. My students talk about me emailing at 3 a.m. Sometimes that happens. But you roll with what you got. And so it's very possible, but it takes everybody working together as a village and everyone being supportive. And don't assume just because someone becomes a mom or a dad, for that matter, that's going to change their commitment. I'm more committed than ever to the profession, to the future. And I have a little girl now who I want to see all of that. And so that makes and I want her to be surrounded by women like Carla and Casey as examples. Whether she becomes a waterfowl biologist or anything, I don't care, but I want her to be around strong women. And I'm really encouraged by currently, some of those people that are out there. So I don't know if I exactly addressed your question, Mike, but like I said, there's a lot to unpack in this.
Will you adopt me?
Yeah, you more than addressed my question, and I thank you for all of that. Casey, hopefully that was good news for you, hearing all of that great advice and insight from Susan. We talked a few minutes ago about some of these other support groups or these initiatives that are underway to promote gender diversity, talk about gender diversity in the workplace. For people that may not be aware of those that are listening to this, that want to learn more about them, do you have some information, the names of some of those entities, places, online websites, or something where people could find some of those?
Yeah, there's one of the big ones is Becoming an Outdoor Woman, and that goes for all sorts of outdoor activities, including hunting. And let's see, I'm sure you can just Google Becoming an Outdoor Woman, and it should be pretty high up there on the list. But there's also, I know in Georgia specifically, they do something called Field to Fork, and that's focused on deer hunting. And they start you off with, I think, a crossbow to kind of make it a little bit more accessible. Some people are not quite comfortable with guns getting into hunting. And it sounds like it's had really incredible success. They advertise at their local farmers market. And I think that's becoming kind of the paradigm of this, hunter recruitment world. Those are the two main ones I can think of right off the top of my head.
What about the Wildlife Society? I'm thinking of our professional societies. Is there anything active within the Wildlife Society related to women in wildlife or something of that nature?
Yeah, there's the Wildlife Society has been really active in all of this for several years now. They've got the Women of Wildlife group, and at their conferences, they have social mixers as well as formal symposia to talk about some of these issues. They've also got a student development group that talks a lot about issues along these lines, as well as a diversity working group. I don't remember the exact name of it, but they're really focused on recruiting diverse people and making sure those people are successful.
Thank you for sharing that, Casey. We're going to start wrapping this up now. We could go on for another hour with questions. I know some of us have things we need to get to. We all have things we need to get to, and so I have a couple of final questions for each of you. The first goes back to something that I asked in the context of hunting, but now I want to pose this question more broadly. We've given each of you opportunities to talk about, to give advice to young women with respect to any of these topics. But I think it's equally important that we talk about advice for men and our role in this. And as I mentioned, we've talked about this already with respect to hunting, but more broadly, with respect to women in the natural resources profession and workplace. Carla, let's start with you. Is there any particular piece of advice that you would like to give men to help move us forward in a more progressive way with respect to gender equality, gender diversity in our profession and in society in general?
I think we've touched on much of it during the course of these podcasts, but really to be supportive, to be a mentor, be encouraging, and just give women the opportunities to do different things. As I mentioned, many of the mentors, all of the main mentors in my life have been men. And they've given me amazing opportunities and pushed me and encouraged me to reach for goals that I may not have done on my own. And, I really thank them for that.
Susan, anything from you?
I think that the main points that Carla said is, stand up and be supportive of women, especially those that are standing out in the profession and might need that confidence. Help them to have that confidence and say, you belong here, even if you don't look like everybody else, in the room. That's an important thing, is to provide that confidence and treat them, as an equal, or in some cases, they're even maybe out surpassing others. Help them to do that. Don't be the one who watches inappropriate behavior and sits on the sideline either. Be the person who says something. Be the person who stands up, because it's hard for women to sometimes say something. Oftentimes when we say something to an inappropriate behavior, we're perceived as the one who's whining, and even if it was meant to be a joke, it's hard. And Casey even alluded to some of the microaggressions, and you don't always, as women, know how to best speak up for those and still keep sort of the professional mentality that you want people to see you as, and not have some kind of bias come out because you spoke out. If men speak up and help support, which sounds like it's happening a lot in Ducks Canada there when there's problems, that's probably where we're going to get the fastest change and the best change, to make sure that it's a positive work environment for everybody. And so I think that's kind of the key thing. And the other I might add is something that was talked about in our Women of Waterfowl session, was recognize your own implicit biases. There's some websites you can go to, just Googling implicit bias tests. We all have them. We all have. In fact, we would be surprised sometimes if you take those tests, what biases you have. Even women, maybe even about other women. Take those tests and recognize them so that you can identify when you might actually be maybe contributing to the problem rather than helping the situation. And you might not have originally realized that, but that's a great professional development thing to help encourage women and diversity in general, is to identify those biases.
And then Casey, you as the millennial, are you seeing some of these things that Carla and Susan are suggesting in terms of men being more supportive? Are you starting to see that happen? And if not, do you just kind of echo that we still need that? We still need to do a lot of work in that regard?
I am seeing that happen. And I think that has a lot to do with who I'm trying actively to surround myself with. The people I try to look up to as mentors are excellent at recognizing that they have these connections that could be really valuable to an early career person, but especially an early career woman who might not have the I don't know, connections that they do. And they really act as kind of a sponsor in pushing them forward, and actively thinking about that. And using some of the tools that Susan talked about, it goes as far as running a job announcement or a letter of recommendation through some programs that they have that you can find online to see whether there's any gender bias in there or any discriminatory language at all. And it's super simple to do, and it makes a big difference. Using words that are typically associated with women versus men. I do see people starting to do that, and I think that's because, as a society, we're having these conversations and really starting to recognize the importance of it. And at the end of the day, we're all kind of working towards the same goals. And if folks find that they're stuck on a problem, I don't think it ever hurts to bring in diverse points of view. And there are other people that might be able to help that you're just kind of overlooking.
Final question to each of you. And Carla, I'll start with you. If you were able to kind of go back and give advice to a younger version of yourself within this realm within this topic of women in the profession, knowing the challenges that you faced, how you overcame them, what advice would that be that would maybe allow you to do things a bit more efficiently or differently? I mean, you are CEO of Ducks Unlimited Canada, so it's like, how much additional advice could you give that would take you in a different direction? I don't know, but I'm going to pose this question to you anyway.
Giving my advice to myself, I would say to believe in myself, to be confident, and to enjoy the ride, because I've had some amazing experiences during my career, and I would just tell myself to enjoy each one of those.
Cool. Casey, same question to you.
I think just really doing what I want because I am interested in it and caring a little bit less about how other people are perceiving that, it would be key. And I think something that I'm still figuring out is kind of defining my own version of success. What does success really mean to me? And, figuring out how to best communicate that to the people who are your mentors and who are in the position to get you to that version of success is something that's really valuable to anybody, but especially kind of an early career waterfowler.
Thank you. And then the final question here, of course, to Susan. Same question to you.
I would say make every experience a teachable moment. Reflect on what happened, why it happened, and how it can be repeated if it's good, or avoided in the future if it didn't work out as planned. Don't back down on your goals. You will make it. And then the other piece of advice I'd give myself is surround yourself with people who want to see you succeed. Casey mentioned that idea of surrounding yourself with those that want to create a positive environment. And I feel strongly that for myself and for others, you want to be around those people who are uplifting, and absolutely don't tolerate anything but respect, and don't waste your time on those who don't really adhere to that. So, that would be my advice.
That's going to wrap it up for this episode. And this has been an incredibly impactful, very important, very exciting conversation. And we greatly appreciate our guests, Dr. Susan Ellis-Felici, Dr. Carla Gwynn, and Ms. Casey Seatash, for joining us to share their experiences and insights on this topic. It's really exciting to think about the progress that we are making in gender equality, gender diversity in this field. But make no mistake, we have much, much farther to go. And this also applies to other traditionally underrepresented groups in our profession. And I hope we all kind of take pride in the role that we can play and the obligation that we have to play in helping make these environments more welcoming. And in the end, as we've talked about before, it's the right thing to do, but also from the standpoint of productivity, creativity, new energy, better outcomes all around. The more diverse we are as a group, the better we end up being. And that's ultimately what we're after. So I hope you all have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. And again, thanks to our three guests for spending a great deal of time with us to discuss these very, very important issues. We extend a very special thanks to our guest on this episode, Dr. Susan Ellis-Felici, Dr. Carla Gwynn, and Ms. Casey Seatash for extended insight and advice on a very important topic. We also thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does in producing these shows, editing these shows, and then getting them out to you. And then the listener, we thank you for your time. We thank you for spending it with us. And most importantly, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.